Welcome back to the Wizard Shop. It is fireside chat time. We're going to talk about Chevy trucks. Let's get started. As the weeks go on, I get lots of emails, and lately I've been getting a lot of emails about Chevy trucks. What era has this? What era has that? What are common problems with a 97 versus an 87 versus... And I've been getting a lot of questions, and finally I decided there's enough emails here to just go ahead and do a video. So that's what we're going to do today. There's different eras of the Chevy half-ton gasoline engines. We will mention a little bit of diesels, but we're not going to go off too deep into diesels. I've had a lot of experience over the years working on them. I've also owned several of them, and I was a little kid when lots of them were brand new. 80s trucks being on the road, brand new. Imagine that. I remember them. We're going to start off with the end of the action line, which is the late 60s to early 70s, but we're not doing 60s. We're just going back from the 70s forward. So the early 70s would be obviously 70, 71, 72 would be the end of what GM called the action line. And here's a picture of one. We all know these trucks. They're very classic. They're very cool. The styling is, even today, is timeless. They're beautiful even decades later. There weren't a whole lot of engine options. You could have gotten the 250 inline six. There's a 350 V8. And I think there could have been a 400 or something like that. But we're really focusing on the half tons. We're not going to get into big blocks and all that stuff. This is the end of the era of points ignition, which we have contact points, condenser things inside the distributor cap. These are really going to be some of the simplest cars to repair. It's technology that's from the 1920s, 30s, 40s, that's still around even in the early 70s. Not a whole lot of changes over the years. Still just a basic engine, basic points ignition, which makes it very easy to repair. Except for the engine stuff like alternator, water pump stuff, actually parts can be hard to find on these earlier classic trucks when you're looking for door handles or wiper motor, things like that. You go to the parts store today and say, I've got a 71 Chevy, I need to get a wiper motor. And they're like, yeah, nah, bro, we don't have them. We can't even special order them. There are places online that specialize in these older trucks. You can look there and get some of the parts. When I was a kid, you could go to an auto parts store and get pretty much anything for a 72 Chevy truck or 71. Not so anymore. So make sure you keep that in mind if you're going to look to buy one of these. You're not going to get as many parts as you thought you would from the local parts store. We've heard many times when the Dodge Rams came out with coil springs all the way around. It's a new feature, never before seen in trucks. And that's a lie, because these trucks had coil springs all the way around in the half tons. If you got a 70, 71, 72 Chevy truck half ton with a 250 inline six, there's coil springs in the front and coil springs in the rear. Now, it wasn't really independent suspension in the rear. It still has solid rear axle, but it was coil springs, not leaf springs. This is the era of truck that Grandpa was familiar with. When you try to quote a tune-up or you try to quote spark plugs, this is what Grandpa thinks about. It's a 15-minute job. It's a 30-minute job. And he thinks that even a 2017 truck should be the same, and it's not. This is Grandpa's era of trucks. These are very reliable, but it's very hard to find a nice one today, and when you do, it's going to be very expensive. You don't pick up these trucks anymore for $800 or $1,000. If you do, they're completely rusted or rotted out. If you find a really nice one, it's going to be at least $10,000 or more. So they're no longer the cheap truck to buy. We do have a video we did on one of these style of trucks. Euro Asian Bob had a really nice C20, I believe it was. It was a yellowish color and it was immaculate. But in case you don't watch the video, here's a picture of what I'm talking about, these style of trucks. The next era we're going to look at is kind of the mid-70s up to about the mid-80s. And there is a lot of technological advances in this time. This is an era where we start to get into the idea of having modules on our truck. The HEI ignition module. Modules weren't on the 60s and 70s trucks. They were all just wiring and mechanical parts. And mentioning HEI, this was the advent of HEI. It's where there's no points, there's no condenser. It's, like I said, a module inside the distributor cap controlling the timing with a Hall effect sensor. And the coil was set on top of the distributor cap. We remember those, the big, large HEI ignition. It was really a really cool thing when it came out. No more points to set the gap on, it's all electronic. And most people who do hot rods today, 350s, 400 small blocks, they're not going to put points on there. They put an HEI distributor. You go on eBay, there's HEI distributors everywhere. It's a very good system. These are the years where we get a large, boxier style truck. It's no longer sleek and smooth on the sides. This actually looks like a big box, much larger. You got the 250 inline six. Now we have a 305 V8, a 350 V8, and 400 V8. Again, we're still having the simple carbureted engines. We still have the basic belts and things like that, the old V-style belts. Everything's still old technology. The only thing really advanced on these was the ignition system. These are very common. A lot of you think an older Chevy truck, this is what comes to mind. They're still very easy to work on. Actually easier to get parts for because they're still somewhat relevant and really, really common. There was literally millions of these trucks made. They're very reliable. But again, these are becoming collectible. So if you do find a really nice one, they're going to be expensive. I can remember when I first got out of the Army, I looked at like an 85, 86 Chevy truck, just a beater to get around in, and it was $800. And it was a pretty good truck. I ended up not buying it, but that's about what they went for. Now they're $8,000 or even $15,000. They're really, really expensive if you find a nice one. As the years go on in this era, they get more and more electronics, more and more modules. Grandpa can still work on this. He still understands the basics. The electronic stuff's kind of, it's kind of annoying, but I understand what's going on, and I can still work on this in my garage at home. The backyard mechanic can easily work on this car, and parts are readily available. Emissions becomes a thing during this era, as we get in, especially in the mid and late 70s. You start having catalytic converters, smog pumps, things like that. And those are types of things that really didn't affect the running of the vehicle, but they become problematic if the catalytic converter gets choked up or the smog pump's not working. Those are known to lock up and actually burn up the belt. And the next big thing is we begin to get into the idea of a pickup truck having overdrive. In the previous generations of truck, you got a TH350 or a manual. It did not have overdrive. It had 1-to-1 ratio. People were driving 55 on the highways. What do you need overdrive for? So the 700 R4 came out. That's a transmission that's basically a TH350, but it has overdrive. And they're really nice. It was a really nice thing. You can go faster, have the RPMs lower, but they weren't a really strong transmission. If you're looking for one of these trucks in the classified ads, you'll see a lot of them say on its third transmission recently rebuilt. They weren't a tough transmission. When you really start towing heavy with these things, they just couldn't hold up. They didn't do well. But if you're easy on them and you maintain them, they're actually pretty decent. This is also the era where you start to see the crew cabs, the four-door, especially in the work trucks. You didn't see so much in the 70s and 60s. And also extended cabs, things of that nature. You start to see a little bit more of this in different makes and models. Now we can haul around more than 3 people crammed up in the front seat. We can actually fit a few people in the back and have a lot more room. And as far as the engines go, this was the advent of the 350 diesel and also the 6.2 diesel, which gave most Americans a bad taste in their mouth about the idea of a diesel anything, a diesel car, a diesel truck, a diesel SUV. Americans today don't like the idea of diesel cars based on these engines, but we're not going to dive into those too much. The next era is the late 80s and into the early 90s. There was a body style change halfway in between, but there was some greater advent of technology coming forth, and it's this thing called electronic fuel injection. I remember seeing these new as well, and you would pull up behind one while you're cruising around, and it would actually say EFI on the tailgate like it's some big to-do, like wow, it's the EFI model. And it really was a big to-do. You start having what's called throttle body injection. We had twin injectors in place of a carburetor, a computer-controlled distributor, computer-controlled fuel. A lot of things started to be computer-controlled. This is the era of cars where Grandpa threw in the towel. He says, oh hell no, I'm not even working on that. It's got computers, it's got fuel injectors. I don't even know what's going on, and I don't want to know what's going on. That was Grandpa's attitude. So this starts to be where the son or daughter of Grandpa, whoever, it could be either or, starts to learn fuel injection, starts to learn how this all works, the electronics. And it's actually one of the simplest fuel injection systems out there. But to someone who wasn't affiliated with fuel injection, it was way over the top complex. 88, 89 was a body style change. We went from the broad-shouldered, boxy Chevy to a little bit more sleeker again, kind of like the 60s. Actually, it looks a little smaller. It's not a lot smaller, but the bodies of these trucks look a little bit narrower, a little bit more trim and slim, I guess you could call it. This is the beginning of onboard diagnostics called OBD1. They did have scan tools that could read those, but you can use a paper clip and cross 2 pins on the diagnostic connector and just count the flashes on the check engine light. You can figure out what's wrong with it. This is also trucks you can work on at home. They're fairly easy. There can be issues with the intake manifolds on these as they get age on them, where the coolant ports on the heads match up to the intake manifold. They can blow out and it can destroy the manifold and cause a lot of trouble. I've seen those on the TBI engines. But these were really good engines. And like I said, the fuel injection on these was really simple. If you're understanding of computers and modules and fuel injection, you will find out that this is one of the easiest ones to work on. I have experience with these years ago at a shop I worked at where you frequently would get one in and say, this thing just won't start. I've put new injectors, a new fuel pump, this and that, and it still won't start. I don't get it. These dang computers, you get an older guy in there, and you find out it won't start because the computer in these vehicles needs to see oil pressure signal from the oil pressure sending unit before it will turn on the fuel pump and let the thing start. It's that simple. That's how the computer on these older models knows that the engine's cranking, by seeing oil pressure. Then it turns stuff on and the engine starts. We end up putting a new oil pressure sending unit on these and starts right up. And then you have Grandpa out there cursing, hey, dang things, I don't understand them. But really, it was pretty simple. And again, we still have the 700 R4s, which were not very robust, which were being abused, and people towing too heavy with them and burning them up. There's a lot of these with bad transmissions that have had second and third and fourth transmissions. And lastly, in the engine bay, we still have mostly metal. We have metal lines, we have metal engine, metal parts, metal sensors. Not so much plastic yet. Still the old school way of building things. These are very reliable, they're easy to find parts for, and if you understand the basics of fuel injection, they actually can be easier to work on than the old carbureted stuff. I would rather fix a TBI engine than an old carbureted one, because it's just, you can look at data and say this isn't working, this is working, boom, this is what's wrong, without needing a gas analyzer or a big giant sun diagnostic thing, hooking up 12 or 15 different wires. Now we're going to talk about mid to late 90s. This was a small little era, it was just 4 or 5 years, but there were some big changes. The body style didn't really change all that much. There were some updates, like a facelift type of thing going on, but the body style was still the same. But there was major, huge changes in technology. This is where we get into OBD2 being introduced. Way more complex computer systems and fuel injection systems. This is where we have the introduction of the Vortec series of engines. Not talking about LS-based Vortex, I'm talking about the old 350, Grandpa's old 350-based Vortex. They had a 305, which is a 5-liter, the 350, a 5.7, And there was a V6, the 4.3 Vortec. These are what I call a crossover era of cars. They're almost where Grandpa can still work on them, but they're getting to an area where even the son or grandson of Grandpa doesn't even know how to work on them. No longer is an oil pressure sending unit telling the computer to turn everything on. We have crank sensors. We have all kinds of sensors, map sensors, airflow sensors, all kinds of things going on. Now, when something's wrong, you really do need a scan tool. This is not one that you start throwing parts at it, because it can be one of about 100 different things that could be wrong. And that starts to add up and get very expensive fast. The main problems with these was the fuel injection system. General Motors decided that the fuel injectors could now not be external, but they'll actually put them inside the intake plenum. So you had to take the intake plenum apart to even get to them. It was quite a big job. These systems, they do last a while, but when they do fail, they're aggravating. Because you have a truck that's worth $3,000 or $4,000, and it can cost $1,500 or $2,000 just to fix the fuel injection system. You get one that won't start, or it runs really rough, and what it is the poppet style injector underneath the plenum have failed. My father-in-law actually had one of these, and he was kind of the old school mechanic, and this system drove him insane. He got so angry about it. He go, you got to take the intake off, and you got to, well, I could find out who designed this, I'll throw him off a cliff, and he just gets so angry about it. Really, it's not that complex or hard, but when you're coming from old school technology to this new style, it's completely alien. Why in the world did you put the fuel system underneath an intake plenum? You can't even get to it, and when you do, the parts are so expensive. It's common to convert these from the old poppet style to what's called MPFI, 8 individual injectors. It does away with the old CPI system. That upgrade in itself is $500-600 just for all the parts and gaskets and everything to make that happen. That doesn't include the labor pulling it all apart. And lastly, these can also have intake gasket problems really bad when they get older. They will usually leak down the back of the engine on the bell housing of the transmission, but these can also leak internally into the engine and wipe out the engine, destroy the bearings. And to get down to that, to do the gaskets, guess what has to come apart? The fuel injection system. You have to pull the plenum off. It's very complicated. I've run into this problem many times with the engines where I say, yes, I've been through this many times. I already know it's going to be $2,000, $2,500 to do all this work. I'm not putting it back together with your old injectors, and then 3 months later the injectors go out and then you're angry. If we're going to do the intake gaskets, we're doing the injectors, we're doing the gaskets, we're doing everything. It's going to be $2,500. And I frequently get arguments. I don't want to spend that much on this truck. And I end up not doing the work because I don't want to spend the money. It's kind of like a timing belt. Doing a timing belt job and using your old water pump. You can't do that. Because you know our luck is 3 months later the water pump starts leaking. Guess what? You get to pull it all back apart again. So this is one of those jobs, if you're going to go into it and do this, you're going to do all of it or none of it. Anytime I run into those problems with those Vortec engines, that's my options. All of it or none of it. And most of the time, it's none of it because they don't want to spend the money. These have the 4L60E transmission now, which is an electronic version of a 700R4, and they have a lock-up torque converter. One of the main problems with these, you'll find out, is they start chattering or they have the torque converter failure going on, which wipes out the transmission. And the reason why, it always comes down to one thing. It's not a flawed design. People say, oh, those transmissions are junk. Actually, they're pretty good. The failure is not the transmission. The failure is the owner of the vehicle. You don't tow with these transmissions in overdrive. You need to put it in D, not the OD, but just D. You're going to lose gas mileage. It's going to be going 3,000 RPMs down the highway, but that's how you tow with a 4L60E. Some of them have a selection for tow haul mode when you get into the newer ones, but on the older ones, shame on you if you're towing a heavy trailer in overdrive through hilly country. That will wipe out your torque converter. That's where these transmissions fail. So the last era we're going to talk about is 2000 to roughly 2007-8. And that's typically the range of all these eras I just mentioned, of people asking questions about cars. Most people are not asking about a 2019 Chevy, or, I mean, they're so expensive. Have you guys seen how expensive trucks are anymore? No, I'm not spending $75,000 on a truck. Never. Not happening. So that's my little take on that. Now back to our era. The era of 2000, 2008 range is a complete new body style. Actually, there's another body style change in 07, 08, but this is where we get introduced to the LS-based engines. No, I know they're not an LS1, a true LS2 or LS1, but they're basically, the architecture is an LS motor. The whole bottom end is pretty much the same, except for cast iron blocks versus aluminum blocks and all that. We have the 4.8, the 5.3, and the 6 liter in the HD half-ton models. These are all LS-based engines, and they're also called Vortec, although it's not the old junky Vortec. This is a new style. These are heavily computer controlled. We don't have distributors anymore. We have coil on plugs. Individual coil for each spark plug, for each cylinder. All computer controlled. Exclusively computer controlled. We have fuel injectors now that are easy to get to. They're external with a fuel rail, like what we would normally think a fuel injection should be. And these engines actually are very easy to work on, but the systems can become very complex for someone who's not familiar with fuel injection and computer controlled engines. This is the era of truck where Grandpa opens the hood, then he closes it right back and says, hell no. I don't even know what the hell's going on under there, and I don't even want to know. This is also the era where Grandpa's grandchildren don't even want to work on it. But the younger generations are saying, this is easy, I understand this. This is a fuel injection. This does that. And I agree with that. They're actually easier to diagnose and work on than the older engines. The processes and way they made the engines, the designs, the bolts, the hardware, the way they designed the entire architecture of the engine is so easy to work on. If it's having issues, you do need to be a diagnostics technician, especially if it's computer-related problems. This is an era of vehicle where you plug in a diagnostic scanner and it'll tell you codes, but you really need to know what you're looking at. You can start now looking at data. You can look at a lot more data than even the older OBD2. You can see all kinds of things going on. Cam timing, crank timing, all kinds of data PIDs is what they're called. And you can watch these and see this isn't working, that's not working, and you don't even have to open the hood and you can know what's wrong. In the 2007-8 range of cars and newer, they did come out with active fuel management. And we're not going to go off into that, but they were very problematic with the cams and lifters and things going bad. And that brings to mind another thing. With the design of this new LS-based engine, you are not going to pull the camshaft out like you could on Grandpa's truck, because the heads have to come off. This is an argument I've had with a lot of older guys or older girls, whoever, on the phone. They're like, yeah, I want to change out my cam, I want to do this. And so you realize it's going to be $4,000 because the heads have to come off, and there's gaskets and head bolts and labor and all this stuff, all these things that have to be tallied up. Oh, you don't have to take no heads off. And they go home and they research it and they call me back and they're like, you're right. This is stupid. The heads have to come off to pull the cam out. You're not getting the lifters out unless you do. It's like, yes, I know that. So keep that in mind if you're looking at this era of truck. On the older generations of the LS-based motor, this is not a problem. I'm only talking about when you get into the active fuel management issues, which was what Crazy D has. He has an 08. But luckily I told him if he has any issues, he does know a guy. These engines have great torque, horsepower, but it doesn't feel like it when you're using them. I've towed with these engines many times, and it seems like when the RPMs are in the lower range, it just bogs, just blah. And then it finally catches and then downshifts and screams, wah, going up a hill like that. I don't know why it's that way or why they made them that way. It seems like It may not be true, the numbers don't add up that way, the torque numbers and horsepower numbers, but the feeling is, to me, is it's a race-inspired engine. It's not meant to lug down low up a hill. These engines like to scream. They like to rev to 5 grand, 4 grand to get up a hill. It's a different way of thinking. If you're used to an old big block or an old 400 Chevy small block, they don't have to scream so hard to pull the power out. But these engines do.
Car Wizard, what hills were you driving around in Kansas?
When we went towing our camper in Arkansas?
I guess. Luckily, that was a small, tiny little camper we were hauling.
Yeah. So keep that in mind. These are rev-happy engines. They like to rev. Same problems with the 4L60E. It's a good transmission until you start towing in overdrive. Make sure to hit the tow haul button or put it into D, not into OD. Because especially if you're getting into some hilly terrain, you'll be in and out of lockup, non-lockup, lockup, non-lockup with a torque converter. And this is what trashes these transmissions. It's really hard on them. So make sure you do that. Another issue with these is the O-ring on the oil pickup tube, which is at the front of the engine. You have to take the oil pan down to get to it. But the O-ring fails, and then it starts sucking up air, and you get low oil pressure or low readings, and you think, oh, I need a rebuild engine, but it's not. It's just an O-ring, and it's easily fixable. There's another technology advancement here also. It's called throttle by wire. We no longer have a physical cable connected to our gas pedal. We have an app sensor, accelerator pedal position sensor, and an electric motor opens your throttle blade, not a cable. So we're getting into an era where you really need to know what you're doing if you're going to diagnose things. You need to watch app sensor versus throttle position angle, be able to check, is it working, is it smooth, is there glitches? That can become very problematic for someone who's not familiar with those. And like I mentioned, this is no longer Grandpa's truck, and it's probably no longer Dad's truck. This is the son's truck. This is the guy that's fully embracing of technology, fully embracing of fuel injection and computer-controlled engines. When there's a check engine light, they don't get pissed off. They actually think, oh, cool, I'll get my scan tool out, and actually have a good attitude about it, and I'll figure out what's wrong and fix it. No big deal. This is what this era of truck is really geared towards if you're do-it-yourself mechanic. These are my favorite era of trucks because, again, obviously I'm not afraid of fuel injection or computer controls. I really enjoy working on these engines. They're easy to work on, easy to diagnose. Parts are very readily available. This would be the era I really recommend if you're going to buy one and you do understand the newer systems a little bit better. You can expect 300,000 to 400,000 miles out of these LS-based engines if they're maintained well and taken care of. With that, those are the 5 eras of Chevy truck that I'm familiar with. I'm not going to go into every detail of every engine and say, oh, you missed this, Car Wizard, or you missed that. I can't get everything because we'd have a 6-hour video. Nobody's going to watch a 6-hour video. Now keep in mind, I'm doing these era of vehicles because it's primarily what we work on. I've gotten emails where people are like, I got a 2020 truck or 2019 truck. I don't have experience on those yet because they're still under factory warranty. People aren't even bringing me those trucks. How can I get experience on them when they're not here? So what do you think about this engine in 2020, Car Wizard? I don't know. They've not been in my shop. I don't know the common failures. And those engines of these newer models haven't even existed long enough to have known the common failures. The time needs to pass in order to figure those things out. So hopefully that answers a lot of questions for you guys in the Chevy or GMC half-ton gasoline truck eras, spanning from the early 70s all the way to about 2008. If you're in the market for one of those and you think, what are the common problems of these era of cars, or what's the story on these era of cars, hopefully this video answers that for you. If you're curious what kind of tools we use to work on any of these era of trucks, check my Amazon affiliates link in the description below. We get a small cut. We really appreciate it. And make sure to hit the subscribe button because there's so many more videos. 400 videos we've done, guys, and I'm sure there's 400 more to come. You don't want to miss out. Thanks for watching.